Okay, everybody, let's get started. So we finished off last time with primary and secondary reinforcers, and then had a brief discussion of delayed punishment. Someone pointed out to me, primary and secondary reinforcers were not in the key terms. I just added them this morning. So maybe just make a quick note of that. So primary and secondary reinforcers, two terms to add. I'll just quickly remind you, primary reinforcers are ones that you don't need to learn that they're reinforcing. So like food, water, warmth. You can use those to reinforce a baby, no conditioning required. A secondary reinforcer would be like an A+, or money. You have to learn that money is good. Babies don't like money, that sort of thing. So, like I mentioned last class, the chapter is kind of broken down into two halves. The first half is mostly about classical and operant conditioning. We have a little bit more to say about operant conditioning, but we're almost done. The second half of the chapter is about other kinds of learning. And most of them are forms of learning that posed a serious problem for the behaviorists. They're kinds of learning that generally involve either something built in, something genetically built in, which they didn't like, or learning that requires cognition, that requires the theory to talk about what's going on in people or animals' heads. But we still have a few things to talk about with regard to operant conditioning, and the first is these two terms, shaping and chaining. These are very important for animal training. So if you ever see an animal, like in a show, doing something really cool, odds are one of these two processes have been used. And they're very similar. They're almost the same thing. Both of them involve what the book calls successive approximation, which means you start with something easy to reward, something you can get them to do very easily, and you reward that. Then you only reward them if they do a slightly better version of that thing, and so on until they are only getting rewarded for doing the thing you care about. So to take an example, suppose my family has a cat back in BC named Luca. Suppose we wanted to train him to jump through a hoop. First, you would give him a treat every time he lifts a paw. Pretty easy to get a cat to do that, so every time it lifts a paw, it gets a treat. Next, it only gets rewarded if it lifts both paws. And then if it lifts both paws and off the ground a little bit. And so on until eventually it only gets the treat if it jumps through a hoop. If you do that process and you're getting it to do just one thing, then you're doing shaping. So like the jump through a hoop, that would be shaping. I'm getting it to do one thing. If I'm getting it to do a series of things, then it's chaining. So for example, if I want it to jump through a hoop and then walk on its hind legs down the hall and then push a door open, whatever, that would be chaining. I'm getting it to do a series of things. But the basic process is the same. And we'll watch a video with a quick example of this. Very simple, just someone training his cat to give paw. So, example of shaping in effect. Okay. All right, we'll stop there. You got the basic idea. Not a perfect case of shaping, as he says. Cat's a little distractible, but that's the basic idea. Successive approximation until eventually you reward them for doing the right thing. And if you did that for a whole series of things, that would be chaining. So pretty simple idea, very effective. Okay. Last thing we have to, actually close to the last thing we have to talk about for operant conditioning is different schedules of reinforcement. This is where Skinner did his best work. He wanted to see how different methods of reinforcement or different schedules of reinforcement would cause different patterns of learning. Schedules of reinforcement. That's not really the testable term. The actual schedule names will be the testable part. So the first distinction you have to know for schedules of reinforcement is continuous versus partial reinforcement. Okay, so for continuous reinforcement, the organism gets a treat every time it does the right thing. So if you're training a pigeon to peck at a green square, every time it pecks the green square, treat. Pretty simple. Partial reinforcement, the organism only gets the reward sometimes. So maybe you can do different percentages, and there's actually a whole bunch of different versions of this, which we'll be talking about next. But essentially, yeah, you only get the reward sometimes. And here's the different pattern of learning that happens. So for continuous reinforcement, the advantage of using that is the organism learns to do the behavior more quickly. So if the pigeon's getting rewarded every time it pecks the green square, it's going to figure out pretty quickly that it should keep pecking the green square, right? No surprise there. With partial, the organism learns the behavior more slowly, but it is more resistant to extinction. Meaning the behavior will continue longer after reinforcement stops. So if the pigeon's there and it's pecking the green square and it's getting continuously reinforced, once the reinforcement stops, the behavior stops pretty soon too, because it's used to getting it kind of every time. Whereas if it only gets the treat sometimes, after the reward stops, it will persist in pecking the green square for longer, if that's how it's been reinforced. There are not many cases where psychology has practical implications for parenting. Paul Bloom, who's one of my favorites, he's the guy who does the intro psych lectures. He specializes in developmental psychology, like child psychology, and he has said psychology has very little to say about how to parent. This is one case where there's a pretty specific application. Suppose there's two kids in different families, Bob and, Jimmy. Bob and Jimmy. And Bob and Jimmy both throw tantrums. They throw tantrums whenever they don't get a cookie. They ask for a cookie in the middle of the day, the parents say no, they throw a big tantrum. And let's say that Bob and Jimmy's parents both give in sometimes. They give their kids a cookie if they throw a tantrum. Whether the parents like it or not, that's reinforcing the tantrums. It means the tantrums will be, I see some nodding, there will be more tantrums if the kid gets a cookie in response. But let's say that Bob, his parents, use continuous reinforcement. They probably don't think about it that way, but this means that every time Bob throws a tantrum, he gets a cookie. But Jimmy's parents are more resistant, so they use partial reinforcement. Only sometimes when Jimmy throws a tantrum does he get a cookie. Now, Jimmy and Bob's parents are sick of this. So they get together and they're like, that's it. No more cookies for tantrums. Cookies are only after dinner. If our kids throw tantrums, we're not rewarding it. Think about what's going to happen then. So both parents stop, and Bob asks for a cookie. He's told no, and throws a big tantrum, nothing happens. Which has never happened before. Up to now, every time he's thrown a tantrum, he's gotten a cookie. Maybe he'll try one or more times, but he's going to figure out pretty quickly that the tantrum business is not working anymore. So extinction will occur quite quickly. Whereas for Jimmy, he throws a tantrum, parents say no. Well, that's happened before. They only reinforce it sometimes. So he's going to persist more. That should be kind of intuitive, right? He's going to keep trying longer even after the reward stops. So that's kind of the trade-off. Continuous reinforcement leads to quicker learning of the behavior, whether good or bad, but quicker extinction. Partial reinforcement has the opposite pattern. Any questions on that? Okay. Now, this latter kind, partial reinforcement, breaks down into 4 different schedules. There's 4 different types of partial reinforcement, all of which are testable. So we'll have a little table here. I'm just reproducing this from the book, so it's the same as the book. So the columns correspond to it being fixed or variable. And then this corresponds to it being ratio or interval. So then you get these specific combinations. So here is fixed ratio. I'll just write FR to save space, but it's the same. It's all the same words that are on the outside. So fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. So these are the 4 schedules. So I'll start with the things on the outside. So fixed means whatever the pattern of or schedule of reinforcement is, it stays the same. Fixed means unchanging. Variable means it changes. Right? Pretty simple. Ratio means that the reward is given per number of behaviors. Whatever the behavior is, pecking, throwing a tantrum, giving paw, whatever, it's per number of behaviors. Interval means the reward is given per unit of time, having done the behavior. So it doesn't matter how many you do, it might be per a certain number of minutes or a certain number of hours, but however much work you do in that period of time, it doesn't matter, it's per unit of time. So then you put them together and you get the 5. So for, at the end I'll give some examples out and try to get responses from the class. But to start off with, let's stick with a pigeon in a Skinner box pecking a green square, right? Pretty simple case. Fixed ratio, it might be, 2 treats for every 4 pecks. So every time it pecks it 4 times, 2 treats. And it stays the same. So it's per 4 pecks, because it's ratio, it's per behavior, and it's fixed, so it stays the same. Variable ratio, okay, one time it's, for 3 pecks it gets 2 treats, then 5 pecks it gets 2 treats, then 1 peck it gets 2 treats, etc. Right? It's random. Changes the number of behaviors needed to get the treat changes randomly. For interval, fixed interval, most jobs are like this. So you get a certain amount of treats for every unit of time. So for every minute the pigeon spends pecking it, regardless of how many times, it gets 2 treats. And then that stays the same. Variable interval, 1 minute, 2 treats. Next time it takes 3 minutes to get 2 treats, then 5, then 1 minute, well, whatever, right? The amount of time changes. Okay, any questions about the schedules?
The fixed interval only works if the pigeon does peck the green square within the 5 minutes, right?
Exactly. It just doesn't matter how many times. Yeah. Okay, now let's use a monetary example, because getting paid is a kind of reinforcement for your job. And let's say you hire a rat exterminator. You have like rats in your backyard, and you don't really care about animal suffering, so you want to get rid of the rats. So the behavior being reinforced is killing the rats. What would a fixed ratio schedule of payment look like?
$30 for every 10 rats.
$30 for every 10 rats, right, exactly. And then it stays the same. What about variable ratio?
If you get 100 rats, you get $100 bonus.
Not quite. So it's still per rat, so it could be 100 rats, but what does the variable part mean? So ratio means it's per rat, and variable means...
Change the amount.
Yeah, you change the amount. So sometimes it's $10 for 10 rats, sometimes it's... it changes the amount of rats you need. So it might be like 10 rats, you get $10, then 30 rats, you get $10, then 5 rats, you get $10. This would be a really annoying kind of job to do, but that's what it would mean. The amount of rats you need to kill to get the money changes. What about fixed interval? How would you pay your exterminator if you're using a fixed interval schedule? Per hour, right? $40 an hour. You might be lazy on the job, doesn't matter. This is one downside of using fixed interval, but that's what it would be. And then what about variable interval?
For 1 hour to be $30 per hour pay. Second hour, it could be diminish it kind of thing.
Good, so this is actually a mistake I used to make when teaching this. The thing that varies is the second part of the name. So it's how long you have to work to get the reward. Although I used to teach exactly what this person said. So for the variable ones, the thing that changes is either the ratio or the interval. So for variable ratio, it's how many behaviors do you need to do to get the treat? Is it 5 rats? Is it 10 rats? It'll change. And for interval, it's do you get paid for 1 hour, for 2 hours, or whatever, and it will change. Okay. Does that make sense? Any questions about that clarification? Okay. One special one to know something about is variable ratio. We'll hear Skinner talk about this later. I have a short Skinner video. Variable ratio is the most resistant to extinction. So remember that all of these fall under the umbrella of partial reinforcement and therefore are resistant to extinction. But variable ratio is especially resistant. So if you stop rewarding, if you're rewarding using this, the behavior will persist the longest afterwards. And as Skinner will say later, this is how reinforcement for gambling works, right? If you're at the slot machine in Vegas or whatever, how many behaviors required to get a reward changes, right? You might pull it 10 times before you get anything, or 100 times, and it'll change randomly throughout the night. And as a result, gambling, extremely addictive. As a matter of fact, it is the only non-substance behavior that is in the DSM-5 as an addiction. Some people have moved to have video games or pornography in there. Maybe they'll get added in the DSM-6, but as of right now, the experts decided there was not enough evidence that those were addictive in the same way, but gambling passed the evidentiary threshold. They decided that gambling was addictive enough to be in the same category as cocaine, alcohol, etc. And part of the reason probably is that it's variable ratio reinforcement. I heard a voice. Hopefully I'm not hearing things. Raise your hand if I hear what is the reason? Is this just me?
He's asking
Oh.
the DSMs.
Oh yes, sorry, of course. The DSM-5, is 5th edition, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, is basically the Bible of psychiatry. I mean, it's not really, because you can change it every few years, which in theory doesn't happen to the Bible, but the DSM-5 is kind of has all the standard diagnoses for psychiatrists: schizophrenia, depression, addictive disorder, etc. So we won't talk about that in any detail. That's more for 105. Okay. Hopefully my mom doesn't watch this lecture. And yeah, the example I gave about payment and the schedules, that's a good way to study. Just think about different jobs and how you would get paid by those schedules. That's a good way to kind of review those schedules of reinforcement. Skinner wasn't just a psychologist, he also was kind of a social critic. He published a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, and had various proposals for how society should be governed based on his findings with his Skinner boxes and his pigeons. Pretty scary books. it's no stretch to say that he was very totalitarian. He envisioned a state that would kind of carefully condition everyone to be what he wanted. Luckily, behaviorism fell out of favor before any of that became popular enough to be implemented. But there are many cases today where these principles have been used for good, not for totalitarian government. And one example that the book talks about is token economies. These are used in various settings where there are people who are difficult to deal with, difficult to control. So prisons, mental hospitals, schools with children who are young and difficult to deal with. I know from experience, I was a camp counselor one summer, and there were 7 boys in my cabin who I had to basically babysit for a week, and they, out of the 7, 3 of them didn't have ADHD. That's literally true. So that was a busy week. I one time walked in on them, and I'd just gone to the washroom, and the window was open. We were on the 2nd floor of a cabin, and Ben wasn't there. I was like, "Where's Ben?" They just pointed at the open window. He was sprawling along the side of the building. So that was a long week. So instituting a token economy is a good way to train kids like that. So you have little rewards, right? Little system of money. For me, with the kids that I was in charge of, I had this game we'd play every night, like a card game, and that was my thing. It'd be like, hey, if you don't misbehave, we won't play the game tonight, which would be, I guess, negative punishment. So you can have systems of reward like that to kind of reinforce good behavior. Okay, to wrap up the section on classical and operant conditioning, we'll watch a video from the man himself, B.F. Skinner, some footage of some of his studies, and we'll also see him talking about what he thinks the philosophical implications of some of his work is. And agree or disagree, Skinner is one of the most important people in the history of psychology, so worth listening to him. So we'll watch that. I'll say a little bit about what he says, and then we'll move on to the last bit of the chapter. Okay. I can't help but comment on the bit at the end about free will. I'll just briefly say something about that. Yes.
Was P.F. Skinner the person who made pigeon-guided bombs?
Pigeons what?
Pigeon-guided bombs.
Pigeon-guided bombs. I have no idea. It wouldn't surprise me. I didn't know that was a thing.
That was a project during World War II. It actually was like a similar mechanism to that. They trained the pigeons to make excellent food, put up a video screen so the pigeon would pick roughly in the direction of like a Japanese cruiser or something. And I just took the launch of bombs. It wasn't very successful, obviously.
Not necessarily, obviously. I mean, pigeons can be conditioned to do pretty crazy things, but anyways, sorry. Anyways, it doesn't matter. I mean, it matters in that it's interesting, but just a little bit about the end about free will. The reason that Skinner rejected free will, and this term is not in the key terms, but he endorsed environmental determinism, right? This is kind of the opposite in a way of the view we saw in chapter 4, which is also false. This is the view that the environment determines everything. And he thought this was incompatible with free will. If we're entirely just determined by the environment. But I want to take a step further, though, because this is a live issue in philosophy today. What about just determinism? Does that rule out free will? Many people, like the humanists, for example, thought that it did. They thought that if everything is determined by prior causes, some combination of environmental and genetic causes, that means we don't have free will. And I'll just note, in passing, for any of you who are interested in philosophy, the dominant view today in philosophy is something called compatibilism, according to which determinism is compatible with free will. And the basic idea is, yes, look, if we are entirely determined by causes, some combination of environment and genetics, we can't have magic free will that like the soul moves the atoms around wherever it wants. We can't have that kind of free will. But we have free will in a much more important sense, which is just you can do whatever you want. Whatever you desire to do and think about doing and have reasons to do, you can do. Who cares if they're determined by prior causes? We are still, as human animals with big frontal lobes, are still able to think about reasons for actions and decide them, even if it turns out that a neuroscientist, an imaginary neuroscientist that knew the position of every atom in your brain and knew all the laws of physics, like yeah, that hypothetical being could predict what you'd do next, but you still did them for reasons that you thought through. That's good enough. This is what my supervisor at Georgia State University worked on. This is his area of specialization. So I mentioned that in passing. I don't think we need to be afraid of determinism, but you will not be tested on this. That's just a little philosophical aside. I can't help myself sometimes.
Ain't free will kind of like a paradox in and of itself? Like, if you got free will, by necessity, you're going to have to ingest information from the environment and make your decisions based off of that. So that's sort of like railroading this form of determinism, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's basically what the compatibilists would say. Maybe not with quite those words, but the kind of free will that's worth wanting is the kind of free will where, yes, you're responsive to the information in the environment, and you're responsive in a way that's consistent with what kind of a person you are. Some people try to make free will this like magical thing, but a compatibilist would say it need not be like that. Yeah. Anyways, if you have more questions about this, you can see me during office hours, because it isn't a philosophy class. I just mentioned that in passing. Okay, so the next kind of third of the chapter or so is about various types of learning that were problems for the behaviorists. Remember that there are those three core assumptions of the behaviorists. Number one, we should only study behavior, not internal mental states. Two, humans are blank slates, which is sort of what I was just talking about, but it's all environment. And number three, the way that the environment shapes us is classical and operant conditioning. So there's various findings, many of them done by people kind of in the conditioning tradition, but various findings came out of that tradition that posed problems for this field. And the first experiment we're going to talk about was done by John Garcia, very cool experiments. I'm going to simplify it a little bit to get the kind of the main point. So you put rats into two conditions. In both conditions, they start off the same. They start off with sweet water, which I'll just call Kool-Aid maybe in passing. We give the rat Kool-Aid that it's never had before. And every time they drink from the Kool-Aid, there's a loud noise. Okay, now in this condition, you make the rats feel sick. In this condition, you make the rats feel pain or fear. So with this one, you just, as they drink it, you zap them with radiation to give them like an upset stomach. Again, bad ethics with animals. So you zap it with radiation, which doesn't cause pain, it just makes it feel like it has an upset stomach. With this one, you electrocute it. Right? So every time they drink it, they feel pain. And remember, every time they drink it, they taste this new flavor and they hear a loud bang. Okay, now, for both groups, they get two water sources. One has neutral water. Actually, let me just put this over here. So just normal, everyday water, but it has the loud noise. The other one has no noise, but it has the flavored, the Kool-Aid. And then same for this one. Okay, so just a quick, there's a lot on the board. So for this one, they drink the Kool-Aid, hear the noise, and they get sick. Then you break it down after they've been conditioned like that. You give them two choices: normal water with a loud noise, or Kool-Aid. Same thing, Kool-Aid, loud noise, but now you're getting electrocuted, so you're being caused to be afraid or to feel fear, and then you have the two choices. In this condition, they avoid the Kool-Aid. Because they felt sick after drinking a new thing they've never tasted before, and so they go, I think what made me sick was the Kool-Aid. So if you taste something new and then feel sick after, you can't really tell what caused you to feel sick. Your body just assumes it's probably that new thing I ate. For this one, they avoid the noise. Because they went to something and they felt pain, they don't go, oh, it's probably the Kool-Aid. They go, it's probably that loud noise. Food doesn't usually cause you to feel pain. It causes you to feel sick. This can't be because of the conditioning. This is something built in. We are built in, we have what the book calls preparedness. There are certain associations that we are more prepared to make. We are more ready to associate a flavor with getting sick. We're not really ready to associate a flavor with feeling pain. It's usually not the cause of pain or danger, right? Usually it's a cause of getting sick. By contrast, we are not ready to associate sound with flavor, or sorry, let me say. We're not ready to associate pain with a flavor, we're ready to associate pain with a noise. So if there's something scary, something that's going to hurt you, we associate it with the noise. So the basic idea is there are certain kinds of associations we are more ready to learn. Any questions about Garcia's experiment?
So the blue connection, like, we just.
The what, sorry?
Like the blue connection, like on the sides, like, because, like, it was.
Blue, you mean the water here?
It just says blue connection.
Oh, on the slide? Oh, I wrote those in the summer. I don't remember what I said.
Oh, okay.
Just from like this, like.
Yeah, like for that, like when you're sick, you only associate it with food, but with pain or fear, you find like other ways like, to explain like why you feel that way.
Yeah, so with both conditions, there's two new things with this water. It has a new flavor and a loud noise. So the sound and the flavor are new. And now something bad has happened. And your brain has to, or the rat's brain has to go, okay, I felt sick. Was it the noise or was it the flavor of the Kool-Aid? Probably the Kool-Aid. With this one, you feel pain. Was that the Kool-Aid or the noise? Probably whatever was making the noise. That's the idea. There's certain associations that are easier to make. And this is a problem for the behaviors because it kind of contradicts the blank slate, right? There's some things that are built in from the beginning, even with a simple mammal like a rat. Yeah.
So both of them are exposed to a loud noise when they drink it, but one experiences sickness and the other experiences pain?
Yes, exactly. So in both conditions, there's noise and flavor. The difference is this part. Do you electrocute it or do you make it sick with radiation? Radiation doesn't cause pain. Depends on the type. This type doesn't cause pain. Yeah.
Can you define token economics?
Yeah, token economy, so that's back in the operant conditioning, is just a system of rewards for like a school or a mental hospital with people who are difficult to teach. It's used for people with autism sometimes who have like serious impairments. They can still be reinforced with simple, like a gold star. Your teacher gives you a gold star, you get 10 gold stars, you get to free lunch or whatever, like that would be a token economy. Any other questions on this stuff, though? So a term related to this, which is pretty simple, is just conditioned taste aversion. You can probably tell what that means mostly from the thing, so that's what's going on in this condition. So through conditioning, you come to find a certain taste aversive. This happened to me with onion rings. I have had onion rings once in my life and never again. I had them right before a turbulent flight. And I'm sure it was the turbulent flight that made me sick, but my body doesn't know that because it's like this, right? I had never had them before, had onion rings the first time, and then was sick an hour later. My body's like, ugh, onion rings. And to this day, like onion rings, I'm like, I don't think so. So that's an example of a conditioned taste aversion. Okay. Relatedly, there are certain things that we are more prepared to be afraid of. Now, before saying this, I'll say something that would make the behaviorists happy. For a lot of things that you would think would be that we would be innately designed to be afraid of, you do actually have to learn that they're dangerous. Even other primates. Primates do not come into the world with a fear of snakes or lions or whatever. It does require some degree of learning. And the behaviorists are very happy. Now there's a catch, but I'll get to the catch after. First, we'll watch a video of orphaned orangutans. This was I think it was in Indonesia. There was this television program about orangutans that had been separated from their families very young, and humans decided to teach them the basics of how to survive in the jungle. And this is them teaching orangutans to be afraid of snakes, and they have to do this because if they don't, they won't be afraid of snakes. So we'll watch that, but then I'm going to add the catch. All right, so at this point, the behaviorists are very happy because it looks like, hey, fear of snakes, not innate. You have to learn it through various means, so it's all the environment. But as I say, there's a catch. I tried to find a video of the other study, but I couldn't find it, so I'll just describe it. They did a study with monkeys who had been raised in a lab, so they had never seen a snake or anything else dangerous. They'd only seen like other monkeys and I guess the humans in the lab. And they had 3 conditions. In one condition, nothing, just control condition. You show those monkeys a snake, no fear, they don't care. Condition 2, you do basically what you did here, except I think the way they did it was they showed a video of of a monkey being afraid of a snake. So a monkey finds a snake, is scared, and runs away. You show that video to a monkey. In that condition, they're afraid of snakes, just like this, right? Condition 3, you take the same video and you edit it so that the monkey is afraid of a flower. The monkey sees a flower and it's like, and it runs away. They do not become afraid of flowers. You can show that monkey that video all day long, it will not learn to be afraid of flowers. So it's both genes and environment. You have to come in kind of ready to be afraid of certain things, and you need some kind of negative environmental experience with the thing in question. This is the idea of preparedness, right? Biological preparedness. There are certain fears that we are more prepared to be afraid of. Yes?
What about house cats being afraid of snakes and things that look like snakes, for example, cucumbers?
Yeah, so I mean, this is just monkeys. Maybe cats are just built to be afraid of snakes. That wouldn't surprise me. But at least in some cases, it's just preparedness. You need both some kind of experience and something built in. Yeah.
How easy is it to untrain something that's related to preparedness, like you both?
Yeah, good question. I would think that it would be harder to train out a phobia that had like a genetic component to it. I would suspect still not impossible. Because in the case of humans, as I was going to say next, most of the common phobias have some of this. Someone tell me, what are some of the common phobias? You could say your own or ones of your close friend. What are some common phobias? Dolls, heights, spiders, germs, right? And when you go through the list, notice what never comes up. Cars, knives, guns, all things that are actually very dangerous, but we didn't really evolve with, right? We tend to be afraid of things that are evolutionarily relevant, right? So even in they did a study, I think it was in Chicago when they had a huge crime wave, and there was literally 0 people with a phobia of guns. But the most common were spiders, snakes, heights, public speaking. Public speaking is basically fear of social judgment because we're a social species. So all of those are sort of things that we have a degree of preparedness to be afraid of. I'm just evolutionarily defective. I've always been more intimidated by one-on-one than public speaking, even when I was in elementary school, so I'm the exception. But generally speaking, situations where there's a lot of social judgment also induce fear in humans. And on the heights case, I'll add one thing, just kind of a fun fact. They've done studies and found that we actually misperceive height. If we're looking up, you could be looking at the same cliff or whatever, if you're looking up at it, it looks lower. than if you're looking down from it. Our brain is biased to exaggerate how high it is when you're in danger, like when you're at risk of falling. Kind of an interesting consequence of this. The book then has a brief discussion of the different brain areas involved in in learning, which the behaviorists didn't want to talk about. Skinner said the brain is a black box, don't even worry about it. The areas involved won't surprise you, so the frontal lobes are involved. The frontal lobes are very flexible and they take the longest to develop, so they're kind of sensitive to inputs from experience. The book mentions the striatum being involved, and the striatum just includes the nucleus accumbens. It's a larger structure. You don't need to know that term. The nucleus accumbens, remember, sends dopamine everywhere, so reward, of course, as we've seen, is an important part of learning. Cerebellum, so that came up in chapter 3. Remember that the cerebellum is like the little brain at the back. It's involved in kind of habitual, well-practiced movement. So it's important for learning. For learning fear, the amygdala, very important, unsurprisingly. Okay, the book then has a little side piece on a horse affectionately known as Clever Hans. Horses are cool. We'll watch this video explaining the Clever Hans. The video does a better job than I will, and then we'll move on to some other animal work. So a pretty famous example, as the video said, it initially was thought that what Clever Hans was doing was actually doing math in his head, but what he was in fact doing was picking up on when people were excited. We've been breeding horses for a long time, and like dogs, they are sort of designed to be in tune with human reactions. That's what artificial selection is capable of doing. So, a little fun example. Don't have much to add to it. We'll move on to insight learning. So, this is another form of learning that was a problem for the behaviorists. Insight learning is when you have an aha moment. There's no conditioning, there's no reinforcement, you're just working on a problem and all of a sudden you figure it out. The book has an example. You put a chimp in a room with 3 boxes and a banana hanging from the ceiling, and chimps like bananas. They pace around angrily, but then eventually they kind of figure it out. They stack the boxes, climb up top, and get the banana. No conditioning, no reward, but they learned something. They figure something out. One more cute animal video, a little shorter, of insight learning in action. Different example, but another video involving a chimp. So, good quick examples. That's again an example of what the book calls insight learning. Okay, next we'll talk about the work done by Edward Tolman, a very important early critic of Skinner's work. Was still doing experiments on rats and stuff like that. But the basic takeaway from Tolman is that you can think of him as kind of an early cognitive psychologist. Cognitive psychology wasn't really a thing yet, but he was emphasizing the ways in which we had to talk about what the rats were thinking, or how they were representing the world. It's not enough just to talk about the schedules and patterns of reinforcement. So here's one example of his experiments. The book has a discussion of this. So you put a rat in the following maze. So it kind of goes like this, and then the treat is in here. And so it's reinforced to go here, right? Every time it goes through this correctly and gets to here, it gets a treat. Okay, no issue for the behaviorists there. But then you put the rat at the same place. It always starts here, but you change the paths. You make this one just like a dead end, and then you have a bunch of paths going out. Now, if it's just reinforcement and nothing else, they should just kind of be going randomly at that point, right? But in fact, what they do is they go to this one. Because they understand, you have to say, they understand that it's that way. Even though they went through this weird path, you have to talk about what the rats know. How they're kind of spatially representing the world. Because they pick this path much more often. And the only real way to explain that is to say, well, they know what direction the place is, even though they went through this weird path to get there. So, very simple term for this. This is what Tolman called a cognitive map. And without postulating something like that, whether you call it a map or whatever you call it, some kind of mental representation of the world, very difficult to explain this result. Paul Meehl, who you don't need to know, but is an important psychologist who used to know Skinner. Skinner only died in like the 90s, so he stuck to his guns when basically no one else did. I mean, I don't know if I respect that or think that's super irrational. I can't decide. But when presented with stuff like this, Skinner would sometimes just walk away. He just, and you know, in a way, hey, good for him. He developed really serious work. He kind of stuck to his guns, did his research, very impactful. But he didn't have time for, what other people were doing. Any questions about this? Okay, one other thing for Tolman is latent learning, which I have a slide for. Latent means like asleep or dormant, kind of hidden learning. So remember, the behaviorists thought that all learning comes from conditioning, right? You have to be rewarded or punished or have some association or something in order to learn. But Tolman's experiments provided very powerful evidence that this was not the case. So these 3 lines correspond to 3 different conditions. In the red condition, the rats are just not reinforced. And what they're reinforced for is doing a maze correctly. So let's say I don't know, you have to go through this weird path, then there's a treat at the end. So, but if the rat's not getting rewarded, there's nothing here. I guess there probably have to be branches off. So maybe there's some dead ends or whatever. And what the y-axis is how many errors do they make? Like how many wrong turns or fails do they make? So people in the red, or rats in the red, are not reinforced ever. The blue line, those rats are continually reinforced. Every time they get to the end, treat. Green is where it gets interesting. Green, they are not reinforced until day 11. Day 11 is indicated by the blue line right here. So they're not reinforced until then. Now before day 11, the blue rats are doing much better than both the red and the green. And that's not surprising. You reward the rats for doing it correctly, they do better. Nothing shocking there. On day 11, you start reinforcing the green rats, and they do basically as well as the blue, in fact, slightly better. Probably wouldn't be statistically significant, but if anything, slightly better. What that shows is they were still learning the maze as well as the blue rats. You just couldn't tell because they weren't getting rewarded for doing it right. So before day 11, the green rats are having latent learning. Learning that you can't tell that they're getting really good at the maze or getting really good at understanding the maze until you reward it. So that's latent learning. Any questions about that? Yeah.
How did the rats know when they came to the end of the maze if they were rewarded? Were they taken out immediately, or?
No, nothing happened. So nothing happens. They get to the end.
In the maze?
Sorry?
They were just left.
Yeah, just left in the maze. Yeah. So what this shows is even though they're not doing it correctly any more than the others, they're still learning about what the maze is like. Okay. Another term that grew out of this kind of these early forms of cognitive psychology applied to rats is expectancy. this is not so much a finding as it is a different way of thinking about classical conditioning. So the cognitive type people tend to construe classical conditioning in terms of expectancy. So think about the person who I sprayed in the face last class, right? So ding, spray, etc. The behaviorists don't talk about what's going on in her head, right? They just talk about the responses. But people who think in terms of expectancy would say, what's going on is she's learning to expect that the spray is coming. So after I've done it a few times, it goes ding, and they kind of react like this. What's going on, according to the cognitive people, is they are expecting a spray to come, right? You have to talk about what's going on in their head, how they are representing the world to be. Okay. Next type of learning is observational learning. Also called by the book modeling. These are synonyms. This was, I should write the name. The name's a good name to know. I forget if it's in the key terms, but just in general, it's an important dude. Albert Bandura, actually a Canadian fella, originally from Alberta, and did his undergrad at UBC. And one of the most important psychologists who's ever lived. Only died a few years ago, actually, but he was an important early challenger to kind of strict behaviorism. And his basic finding is that people can learn behaviors just by watching other people do them, without being reinforced. You watch someone else do something, and you come to learn to do the behavior. According to Bandura, there are 4 things required for this to occur. Attention, you have to have the capacity to pay attention, to observe what someone else is doing. You have to have memory ability, you have to be able to retain or have retention of what you watch them do. You have to be able to reproduce or copy the behavior. And a term that I don't think I listed in the key terms, but it may come up 105, you have to sort of believe that you're able to do this, which Bandura called self-efficacy, which was important in his work, which is basically the belief that you can do something, the belief in your own effectiveness. I guess I should say reproduction to keep it consistent. And lastly, motivation. You have to want to do the behavior in question. There is a biological basis to this, and it's something called, and again, I believe this is not in the key terms, but either way, it's kind of an interesting term to know. The basis of this is mirror neurons. We have neurons that are designed to be engaged both when we do something and when we watch someone else do something. So right now, I'm lifting my left hand, so the right motor cortex is active, but so is all of yours. When you watch this, there are cells that will respond both when you do this and when you watch someone else do it. That seems to be the physical basis of this. Okay, the book also has a discussion of the connection, or actually before that, I'll show, this is a very famous study, I kind of have to show this one, the Bobo doll study. Very simple finding, oh, sorry, yes sir.
Do you think mirror neurons kind of explain why when we see another person yawn, we also yawn as well?
I would bet so, yeah. I haven't seen studies on the specific example of yawning when someone else yawns, but I would suspect so, yes.
What was the difference between attention and retention?
Attention is observing someone doing something. Retention is remembering how they did it. Kind of holding that information for later. Any other questions about the terms on the board? Oh, yeah.
Can this type of observational learning be applied to the concept of how like autistic people mirror people's behavior and everything? Like they kind of don't know how to act in certain situations, for lack of a better word. Like they don't know how to behave in a certain situation and everything until they see somebody else and their reaction.
Oh, I was going to go a different direction with the autism connection. I'm pretty sure, and double check later, you can go on Google Scholar to see if this is true. I believe there are studies of autistic people and mirror neurons, because autistic people have deficits in kind of the empathy system, the ability to kind of understand other people's emotions. So I would bet that they would be worse at observational learning. Again, not my area of expertise, double check on Google Scholar, but I believe there is evidence there. But as I say, you can double check that on Google Scholar. Yeah.
It's just kind of anecdotal, but like I have a little brother with autism,
Mhm.
so I can kind of say it's I find that you have to model behavior like a lot for him to
Yeah.
get it, a lot more than like a neurotypical like child. So that's just kind of my take.
That's consistent with what I would bet. Of course, one case isn't like decisive proof, but that sounds right to me. Any other questions? Okay, so as I say, this next study is very famous. It's probably what Bandura is most famous for. Very simple study, but it was still a problem for the behaviorists because again, they don't like this stuff because it's not classical or operant conditioning. So why would we go here? But all they did was they put kids in two conditions. Kids would have to spend time in a room with a Bobo doll, which is this big, goofy-looking doll. In one condition, they watch an adult standing there just looking at the Bobo doll, and the other they watch an adult beating the crap out of the Bobo doll. And the result is exactly what you would think. So we'll watch that. You'll see Bandura explain it a bit, and that should be the last video of the day. Okay, you get the idea. The video goes on with that, but very simple finding, and again, exactly what you'd expect. But okay, well, it's very easy to find. Bobo doll YouTube. You know, you'll probably find multiple videos of it. Okay. So to sum up, you'll remember that I mentioned those three core assumptions that the behaviorists had. This last bit of the chapter has posed various problems for those. So the core assumptions again are only study behavior. And the problems here were things like Tolman's work on like cognitive maps, right? There are experiments where you kind of have to talk about what's going on in the animal's mind, right? Various thought processing paths. Or even things like classical conditioning, right? It makes more sense to talk about things like expectation, what's going on in the animal's head. Number two, humans are blank slates, and other animals too. Again, think of the preparedness work, right? We're not entirely blank slates. There are certain associations that we are more ready to learn, and certain fears, for that matter, that we are more ready to learn. And lastly, they said it's all classical and operant conditioning, but there are, in fact, other forms of learning. There's insight learning, latent learning, and as Bandura just discussed, observational learning. You can learn from watching other people do things, even if you're not being rewarded. Any questions? All right, it's a miracle. We actually finished before exam review day, so we can stop there. I have nothing more to say. I'll stick around if you have questions. So Tuesday we'll be discussing what the written is and reviewing the 3 chapters, and then next Thursday, of course, is the test. Enjoy your weekend.